Chapter 9, Flowers of Edo. We did it, said Annie. We made our own magic. Yeah, we got the cloud dragon to put out the fire, breathed Jack. He felt dazed. Do you think we're near Basho's house? I think so, said Annie. We asked the cloud dragon to take us there, so I bet she did. Come on, let's find Basho. Jack and Annie stood up and started walking along the edge of the river. They walked barefoot through the mud, under dripping trees. Hey, there's the clearing, said Annie. Jack and Annie headed toward the clearing, beyond the trees and tall grass. Oh no, cried Annie, look. In the clearing, rain was falling on the charred ruins of Basho's house. The shingled roof and bamboo walls of the little hut had burned and collapsed. Where's Basho? Said Jack, scared. There, said Annie. The famous poet sat on a log next to his banana tree in the gray rain. His clothes were blackened. His face was covered with soot. He clutched his writing box. Basho! Yelled Annie. Basho looked up. A smile crossed his dirty, weathered face. I looked for you by the river, but didn't see you, he said. I'm glad you are safe. We're glad you're safe too, said Jack. But your castle burned down, said Annie. Yes, it burnt. It burnt before the miracle of the rain, said Basho, sighing. Jack and Annie sat on the log next to him. Through the smoky drizzle, they all stared at the rubble. Trees and plants dripped with rain. A pigeon cooed. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Annie broke the silence. I'm glad you still have your banana tree, she said. I like the sound of the rain falling on the leaves. Basho looked up, but didn't say anything. Yeah, and I like the sound of the river, said Jack. It's louder since the rain came. Basho tilted his head as if listening to the rain on the leaves of the banana plant and to the steady rushing sounds of the river. His face softened. Yes, I like those things too, he said. He held up his wooden box. And I still have my poems. Don't worry, Basho, said Annie. Everything can be built again. And your castle will be even more beautiful than before, said Jack. Basho smiled. I suppose that is why the ancients called our fires the flowers of Edo, he said. What do you mean? Asked Jack. After something is destroyed by fire, a good new thing often takes its place, said Basho. Just as after the bleakest winter, beautiful flowers return with the spring. I'm sure you'll make many beautiful flowers, said Annie. Thank you, said Basho. I am sorry, though, that you and Jack will not have a place to stay now. Don't worry, said Annie. We have to travel back to our own house. How far away is that? Asked Basho. Very far, said Annie. She and Jack stood up, but we just need to get back to the Imperial Garden. We'll know the way from there. Good, said Basho. He stood up. Come, I will accompany you. Back to the garden. Thanks, that would be great, said Jack. Basho picked up his walking stick. Then he led Jack and Annie along the bank of the river. Through the light drizzle, they saw a ferry boat moving upstream. Basho waved, and the pilot steered the boat to the shore. Jack and Annie followed Basho onto the ferry. The three of them sat together on a wooden bench. The other passengers stared at them. Many had ashes on their clothes and soot on their faces. Jack was relieved to see that no samurai were on board. Greetings, Master Basho, the pilot said. The other passengers nodded respectfully to Basho. They smiled as if the presence of the great poet gave them hope. The rains were a miracle, were they not, Master Basho? An old woman said. Indeed they were, said Basho. I guess the cloud dragon showed up just in time, said Annie. Annie, whispered Jack. Basho smiled at her. I am afraid no one believes in the cloud dragon anymore, Annie, he said. But it is lovely to pretend, is it not? Yes, it is lovely, said Annie. The rain stopped as the ferry boat traveled on up the river. Mist rose from the water, and birds began to sing. When they passed the tea houses, Jack and Annie saw firefighters cleaning up after the fire, sweeping up broken tiles and scrubbing the walkways. Waiters were bringing them tea. The sun was shining by the time they passed the puppet stage, and the charred lumberyard. Wisps of smoke still rose from the black piles of burnt logs. The ferry boat floated on through the bright morning. It glided under the great bridge and past a crowded fish market. Fishermen were hauling in their catch from the night before. By the time they moved past the samurai castles and came near the moat of the imperial garden, the sun had completely dried out Jack's and Annie's kimonos. The boat pulled up to the landing. Basho helped Jack and Annie onto the dock. He waved goodbye to the boat passengers. Jack, Annie, and Basho walked over the stone bridge that crossed the moat. They walked through the massive gates in the high wall. Then they followed the paths of the imperial garden, around the big rocks and the ponds with the swans. Jack kept an eye out for horses and samurai warriors. But the garden was as peaceful as when they had first landed. It was filled with birdsong. The willows swayed. Water from the waterfall tumbled into the green pool. Jack caught sight of the sun shining on the treehouse, high in the cherry tree. Jack stopped walking. "We know our way home from here," he said to Basho. "Are you certain?" asked Basho. He did not seem to notice the treehouse in the cherry tree. "We're sure," said Annie. "Once we start on our way, the trip will get easy." Basho nodded. "You remind me of the famous saying of the samurai Masashi, he said. "A journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step." "I've heard that saying before," said Jack. "Words can outlive their creators," said Basho. "Though I will never be so lucky as to have mine outlive me." "Don't be too sure of that," said Annie. Basho gave them a little smile. I hope you both will return to Edo someday," he said. Look for me when you come back. I should have a lovely new castle on the river by then." "Thanks," said Jack. "Goodbye," said Annie. They both bowed to Basho. Basho bowed to them. Then the great poet turned and left them. Falling cherry blossoms floated in the wind as he walked away. Jack and Annie watched Basho until they could no longer see him. Then they turned to go. Just as they started walking, a man stepped out from the shadows of the garden. The man wore a blue coat, and 2 swords hung from his belt. "Excuse me," said the samurai. "May I see your passports, please?" Dun, 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 dun. And that ends, chapter 9.